It's a strange world, isn't it? That great oil painting fetches tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds and is highly rated. And our civilization has a way at different times of looking at different things and valuing different things in different ways. Here is something which, I'm sure I haven't seen it all, but I'm pretty old and I look at stuff all the time. And I have seen nothing anywhere that matches this.
As you turn to the back pages of the catalogue for our latest Richard James exhibition, and you scan your eyes down the lists of ingredients, for want of a better word, in these extraordinary assemblages, you'll see amongst them the unusual remains of the outer islands of the west coast of Scotland: guillemot feet, seals' teeth, urchins' tests. For many years, Richard has been travelling to the Outer Hebrides, the islands off the west coast of Scotland, to collect the material for these reliquaries, boxes. I'm not quite sure there's a single word that describes the complexity of what Richard does. But when I went to visit him a couple of weeks ago before this show, I found that there was something slightly different about the work on display in this exhibition now. There was some kind of emotional change. I wasn't quite sure, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But when I spoke with Richard, he said he'd not been back to Scotland in the last 4 years. In fact, something that he'd not thought possible before, he'd been collecting for the last 4 years in the local Nen Valley around his house in Oundle. And so now joining those more extreme relics from the northern coastline of Scotland, we have more familiar faces to us here in Uppingham. A tiny wren laid to rest here in a glasses case found down by the river. It struck me when I was driving to Richard's and I was winding down roads that I've driven on many years in my life. I used to live in the same area. In fact, drove past Richard's house every day on the way to school without knowing that he was tucked in his studio at the back of the house making work like this. And I realised that just moving from the gallery here in Uppingham across the county line into the Nen's jurisdiction, where all the material in this particular piece would have been found, there was a change going on in the landscape around me. Something inside me, I wasn't quite sure what it was, could notice this subtle change of rhythms, of tones going on in the countryside. Richard's work taps into this feeling that I think is in all of us. Many years ago, in the 1980s, biologists came up with an idea called biophilia, the idea that within all of us there is an intense fascination, an intense need to affiliate with all kinds of life form. And that innate power within us was what drove us to decorate, to ornament our lives, our living spaces with patterns that drew on the natural world around us. As we look around the 20-odd pieces of work in this exhibition made over the last 3 years, incredible devotions of time and effort and energy and brainpower into them, I can see in Richard something of the old scribes of medieval times penning delightful marginalia into the sides of their Bibles, or to people making vast, complex gardens. There is something of that biophilic, innate affinity for life, a kind of nature worship, a devotion, a need to celebrate and to revere the life around us that is celebrated in these works. So what else has changed in those last 4 years? How has the work moved on? I think the changes are there, much like I felt driving to Richard's house, feeling the slight change in the textures, the rhythms of the countryside as we entered the Nen Valley. There is an emotional change in this exhibition too. I think Richard's work has opened out. At times he's been more sparing than he has in the past, leaving much larger swathes of his beautiful photography untouched, very minimal arrangements on top of them. That photography itself has certainly taken more of a prominent backdrop to his work, especially in terms of the colour. There's some beautiful effects that he's managed to get from photographs of jellyfish bells, of urchins, of lichen on the surface of rocks. Using digital trickery to turn those into symmetrical images, they kind of remind me of Rorschach ink blot tests. And they have the same kind of effect on you as you look at them. You're starting to pick out patterns, trying to form what you see in this kind of strange shape into something meaningful, but also seeing in it reflections of something else. For example, in the beautiful jellyfish bell laid out on the sea, suddenly you see it turning into some kind of vast star nebula. There's something quite typical about the Nen Valley too, though. It's a land of shadows and pockets. It's very different from the vast expanse of Harris, where you have these extremes, the storms out at sea, the great torrents of water thrown up, these great sort of lurching mountainous islands. There's something a little quieter, a little more intimate about it, and I think that's reflected in the palette in Richard's work this time. That ranges from very dark and kind of smoky, black Gothic, to works that are much lighter, brighter, much brighter hues. One thing that's for certain, I think, in Richard's work is, although there are elements of all kinds of different kind of box making, collecting, arrangement in this show, it's not a rational thing that Richard is doing. It's not based in that kind of 17th century need to order everything, to classify everything, to find some kind of intelligent pattern in the world around us. It comes from a much deeper place. It's a much more instinctive, intuitive, compulsive place. And I think you see that reflected in the work itself. Works that seem more like reliquaries or diviners' charts than they do German Wunderkammer, for example. We've got a wonderful example of what I was just talking about here in this beautiful photographic space up here. This amazing rich red that you see in a couple of pieces across this show. It reminds me of John Martin's vast catastrophic paintings. There's a real punch of colour in this work. When you get up close though to this lower half and you see this amazing concentric circle going on here with these extraordinary insects that have been collected, and the fineness with which this anatomical figure has been cut out. There is something luthier precise about Richard's work. It really taps into that same part of our brain that delights in mechanism, the same part of our brain that loves to see the back of a watch opened up and to see the mechanism of the cogs moving around each other. Get up close with Richard's work and you see how extraordinarily precise he is having to work with his material, working on tiny, tiny margins of error. And you might imagine, working in that way, that he would be extraordinarily pedantic and precise about it too, that everything is perfectly mapped out, that everything is placed within a pinpoint of where it needs to be. But actually, Richard told me, a lot of it is very intuitive. He keeps a sketchbook, he notes down the rough idea, the rough feeling for works, but most of it is, again, compulsion. It's finding the right piece and suddenly seeing it slot into place. I think you see that more and more in this exhibition, and you see it in some of the freer compositions in this show too. Something like this box here, which almost has the feeling of a kind of still life, like these objects were just left on someone's shelf. This dice that's just about, looks just about to be tumbling off the shelf here. all these cards that have been propped up. And of course, when you do get in close and you start to notice the details, it's then also that you notice the strange things going on in Richard's work. And I don't mean just the strangeness of the composition. You start to notice dragonflies that you thought were dragonflies are in fact painted bones. Nothing is quite what it seems at first sight. I've never come close to the kind of craft work involved in Richard's extraordinary assemblages, but I did tell him a couple of weeks ago when I met him of how, for a school project, I put together a box inspired by Joseph Cornell, perhaps the most famous box-making collage artist of the last 100 years. It was a passion project over a summer, and it involved collecting 30 or 40 wasps, dead wasps, from my sister's windowsill, and trying to thread jeweler's wire around them and promptly severing most of them in half. Incredibly difficult to do what Richard does with horsehair, fishing line, all kinds of materials. But it was an interesting comparison to make, and it's one that Richard hears all the time. Joseph Cornell is the name that often comes up when we see his work. In fact, the two are nothing alike. Apart from the basic conceit of boxes, birds, animals, strange ritual objects, there's something often quite stuffy and suffocating in Cornell's work. He was looking in a very different direction to Richard. Richard is fundamentally a reanimator. He's not just taking dead material and presenting it to us, he is remaking it anew. He is finding new life amongst the remains. And actually, what a strange word that is, remains. The idea that these are things that are left behind. Richard's not thinking about the past, I don't think, or certainly not about the immediate past. His work is full of the possibilities of new life. Never in Joseph Cornell do you get anything approaching the kind of strange, imaginary combinations, the chimeras that you get in Richard's work. These awesome leviathans made out of feathers, wings, vertebrae, bird skulls, or this bizarre combination of dead starfish here, which our eyes tell us immediately when we look at it, even in this driest, desiccated state, that this is something of the water, with this feathery, tarred bird's head here, which we know immediately is of the air. It's not hard to see that Richard is making incredibly complex work that is deep and rich and thoroughly elusive. There are all kinds of references going on in these pieces to all kinds of different things, threads that you can pull on, be taken down one rabbit hole after the next. Just in this 4 pieces here, named after the Divine Comedy, we've got hell, purgatory, the Edenic Garden and Paradise. The writer T.S. Eliot said of Dante's Divine Comedy that what made it great was not that it was this immensely dense, rich, elusive thing, not that you could follow all of these threads, but that more than that, it had a vision. It could communicate long before it is understood. And I think that's something absolutely vital to Richard's work. When we come to an exhibition like this and we look around these pieces, there was a real desire in us to ask the question, what is it about? What does it mean? Particularly faced with something where the reference is so obviously in front of us, something strongly redolent of Catholic reliquaries, of iconography, the catalogue of saints here. Something in us needs to know, what is it about? What does it mean? And I've never quite understood that question. I've never quite known, what does it mean? What does that mean? Instead, I think we have to accept the work at face value. We have to accept the vision and more ask the question, why has Richard made the work that he has? I can't speak for him in this respect, but I can tell you a little bit about how it makes me feel. It reminds me of being a young boy and walking into giant Italian cathedrals or tiny churches on holiday with my family. And there's a particular feeling when you walk into a place like that, an ancient place, and it's empty and you can hear your own footsteps. You become incredibly aware of yourself in that place. The smell of the stone, perhaps of incense. You don't have to have any faith, you don't have to have any doctrine, any dogma behind you to feel some kind of profound connection in that moment. It's the feeling that comes inside you and makes you feel like you want to light a candle or to sit in silence and give your gift of a pilgrimage. I get the same feeling standing in front of Richard's work. I don't think it's about logic. I don't think it's about trying to find interconnections in the world. I don't think it's rational. I don't think it's necessarily intellectual, despite the vast references going on in it. I think it's compulsive. I think it comes from a very deep sense of duty, of need. I know that Richard would be collecting this material even if he wasn't making this art. The way he puts it together in these boxes, it's an incredibly complex process, a complex mixing of all kinds of profoundly moving and meaningful things to him. And the result is work that, in that complexity, triggers something else in us. It's not about what is it about, it's about that feeling of deep resonance and connection. I think if you come and visit this exhibition, that is what you feel walking around this show. It's amazing how people from different walks of life can find themselves drawn to any element in these works. They find it speaks to them. I think that speaks to the richness of what Richard's doing. But more than that, I think it speaks to something very deep and profound and shared in all of us. That biophilic sense of an affinity for life, all life around us. It's why this exhibition is called After Life. And I hope that you can make it to the gallery here and see it for yourself.
Here, I think we are really wonderfully lucky that we've got something which I suspect is world class, that's on the walls and that's buyable. And I would also make the point that I'm pretty certain that if no one bought another one of these boxes, he would continue making them until he could make no more. And for that, I thank you.